Welcome. Thanks for being here again at Food Literacy for All. Again, we have students and community members, so I want to welcome all of you. We have just a couple quick announcements before we get to our panel this evening. So first of all, every week we want to thank our sponsors, the School for Environment and Sustainability, the Food Systems theme there, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Center for Engaged Academic Learning, the Center for the Education of Women, Francis and Cindy Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund, Seed Wayne at Wayne State University, the School of Public Health, and the U of M Urban and Regional Planning Program at Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. So moving on for tonight, again, if you're a community member and this is your first time, welcome. Thank you so much for continuing to RSVP each week or for the classes that you come to. It really helps us to know who's coming. Also, reminder, it's called spring break or winter break next week, so there is no food literacy class next week, so we'll resume after that. So that no class March 5th. Next week we have a free shuttle from Detroit for Anna LaPay's talk. So our partners at the Detroit Food Policy Council are organizing that. So you have to email, I think you have until tomorrow or so to email Kabibi at the Detroit Food Policy Council if you'd like a spot. So we're offering it free, round trip shuttle. Tell your friends in Detroit that they can catch a ride. Other weeks you can catch a ride with Mama Jerry. I just have to leave this slide in here every week. Yeah, she got to take her. You might be next. Also, I just want to remind the community attendees that now we have live polling for everyone as well. So it's not just the students. Raise your hand right now if you don't have a clicker, and Elise can come around and give you one. And also just a reminder to, before you leave, please drop the clicker back off in our yellow bags so that we can give you that another week. All right, I think that's about it. Do you want to start? Well, you do your intro, and then you can start with your question. So now I'll introduce Mama Jerry for this week's panel.
Thank you. All right. How y'all doing? Yeah, sun was shining today, huh? Cool. So, thanks for coming tonight. We have an also awesome panel from Detroit. All Detroiters, woo-hoo! And we will be planting seeds of resistance by talking about the story of food waste. And so I'm very excited about that. And hope you will have an awesome experience today as well. Before we start, I want to start with our clicker question just to test everything out. So make sure it's powered up, press the button, and hit BB. Make sure you're syncing. We okay? Yeah. All righty. So I got a question for you, fun one. Go for it. I can't see the results. Not working, huh? Are we having technical problems? Is it?
You can push if you like on the fire remote's not working right now.
Okay.
But we can open it while I figure it out. There we go. Oh.
We're good?
We're good.
All right, let's go. All right, smart class, hey! Very cool. Okay. All right. Well, that's okay. You're still smart. Okay, so I'd like to take this time to introduce our panel, our awesome panel, and I'll start by introducing Meg Berg, who is heading up sales and marketing at Planted, a startup vertical hydroponic farm on the Lower East Side of Detroit, while she pursues the dream of launching small format grocery in Detroit neighborhoods. Startup life must be fun. Since Meg was previously in supply chain team leadership at Blue Apron, developing category management for the large-scale meal kit company. Prior to Blue Apron, she worked for family-owned conventional grocery chain Rallies. Meg is a First Movers Fellow for 2015 of the Aspen Institute Business and Social Society Program and holds an MBA from Purdue Graduate School and a BA in Human Biology from Stanford University. Meg's career has traversed from farm to fork, literally, and she is passionate about creating a more sustainable food system through industry disruption, community engagement, and delicious experiences. When she's not at work, Meg can be found spending time with her wife and their family of doggos, 3 of them, baking sourdough bread, my favorite, and riding bikes. Welcome. You're welcome. Next, we have Rene V Wallace, who has the privilege of serving visionary leaders in their community by helping them to see, S-E-E, strategize, engage, and execute. She is the executive director of Food Plus Detroit, a food systems development organization that facilitates action learning, engagement, and innovative projects. Renee is currently working to develop Detroit's compost ecosystem and infrastructure with an emphasis on organics diversion, food, yard, and paper waste. The strategic approach to this effort includes cultivating the marriage of good policy and good practice through a portfolio of pilot projects. Experimental-based public engagement and education, and policy advocacy through the Michigan Organics Council and the Detroit City Council Green Task Force, Organics Recycling Committee. The goal is to create an enabling environment for a decentralized citywide compost system with diverse scales ranging from backyards to industrial, interdependent with related operations like hauling, sorting, and more. Renee, welcome. Next, we have Anthony Hettinger, is a 2008 Horatio Alger National Scholar and a 2017 Global Leadership Summit attendee. Anthony has a BA in Religious Studies, a minor in Horticulture and Sustainable Food Ag and Food Systems specialization from Michigan State University. Don't judge. Where he utilized his talents working with Central Detroit Christian as their garden production and aquaponics manager, helping to sustain Detroit's first indoor fish farm, and that happened to have been in the neighborhood that I work in. He serves as the CEO / co-founder of Detroit Intro, a sustainable farm and innovation firm raising insects for a better world. Their initial product line includes cricket protein powder, cricket fertilizers, and other downstream byproducts. In the future, they aim to develop modular farming solutions that are decentralized and create greater economic value for smallholder producers, starting in Detroit and eventually expanding globally. Anthony is also a herbalist, landscaper, and has previously served on the Voices for Earth Justice Board of Directors. Welcome, Anthony. So what we'd like to do at this time, we do not have slides this evening from each of the panelists, but we have asked them to talk about their work for 10 minutes each. So we will do that, have some clicker questions, and then we'll have a casual discussion to take a deeper dive. Is that okay? All right. So Anthony, I'd like to start with you.
Hello? Is this coming in? All right. How's everyone doing tonight? Good, good. So my name is Anthony Hadinger. Like Jerry mentioned, I co-found Detroit Ento. And just so everyone knows, I brought some sriracha crickets for everyone to try. If you don't have a shellfish allergy, feel free to indulge. So I moved to Detroit in 2013 after studying at Michigan State, horticulture, religious studies, and sustainable ag and food systems. And in that work, I was looking more towards, complex agricultural structures and what does it take to really start, engineering the food of the future. So I had a choice between grad school and moving to the city and just starting to work. And through a volunteer program I was doing at Allen Neighborhood Center, I got connected with a banker from Wells Fargo who was doing work with Central Detroit Christian, CDC. They got me acquainted, and I moved down a week after I graduated. And so at CDC, I was doing all of their urban gardening programs. We had about an acre or so of fruit and vegetable production, orchards, apothecary garden, and produce market. And they have a structure where they had 8 or so for-profit businesses that flow back into the nonprofit. And another major project I helped kind of spearhead with them was the CDC Farm and Fishery. And that was an indoor aquaponics farm that was converted from an old convenience store. And we had a tilapia farm in the basement. We used the fish effluents to grow herbs in the upper level. The herbs would clean the water and go back down to the fish, and we were creating a closed loop system. So in that time, we were also looking at ways to feed the fish more sustainably and economically. And so we started looking at insects as a possible source of feed for the fish. So we started growing red wiggler worms, using food waste from Peaches and Greens, our produce market, as well as the fish waste that we had on site that we also used to fertilize our outdoor gardens, of course. Then we started playing around a little bit with fly larvae, and I took a trip to Chicago in the summer of 2014 to go visit the plant, which is a large packing, used to be a meat packing warehouse that they've turned into like a multi-use business incubator that had aquaponics, kombucha brewers, so on and so forth, mushroom growers. And I connected with their shrimp growers who told me about a seminal report that United Nations put out in 2013 that was documenting insects as food for the future. And they were positing the idea that insects could viably fit food for people, for our pets, and potentially for livestock. So at that point in time, late 2014, early 2015, the regulations aren't where they are now. They still aren't quite firm in terms of using insects for food, but at that point they were even less formed. And so we decided to look at insects for human food. So there was already a burgeoning market with about 40 or so food manufacturers ranging from protein bars to chips to alternative meat sauces that were already using insect protein. And so we were looking at it from the perspective of production. Since it is still a pretty new industry, we were looking at creating a model where we can produce and process together on site, and be able to kind of train up farmers in this new type of agriculture that has, kind of a year-round benefit. So crickets are one of what they call the gateway bugs, alongside things like mealworms, where they have a tremendous benefit to human nutrition and environmental. They have also a much lower footprint than most animal sources. So on the nutrition side, crickets have more protein than beef, more iron than spinach, more calcium than milk, more B12 than salmon, as much B12 as salmon, and as much omega-3s as salmon, but it also is full of prebiotic fiber, so it's good for gut health as well. And it has about the same amount of protein as an egg, so about 7 to 8 grams per 2 tablespoons. At the same time, they're using about 2,000 times less water. That's probably the biggest stat. About 10 times less space, and they produce almost 0 greenhouse gases. And so when we think about the future and a climate insecure one at that, in terms of our protein production, paired with a rapidly growing population that are taking on more westernized diets that are protein heavy, we have to start looking at some of these different alternatives that can be grown indoors year-round and sustainably. So this is just a piece of the puzzle. This is going to go right alongside things like mushrooms and algae and seaweed and synth bio and different type of plant proteins that can be bioengineered as this patchwork quilt of alternative proteins. And so where we kind of are in terms of projecting the market growing and how food waste is a part of this solution, they expect by 2050, we'll have 2 billion more mouths to feed. And in that time, they expect the alternative protein market to grow to about 330 million metric tons per year of consumption on the human front. And so insects have a really great potential to solve some aspects of food waste ailments. So crickets are omnivorous. In nature, they're kind of like worms. They eat detritus, leaf litter, wood chips, other insects, as well as plant material. And so in our trials, we've been integrating juice pulp from different juiceries and things like kale stems from organic restaurants or restaurants that use organic produce, and supplement that with the grain-based feed that we use now. So we have a soy-free, gluten-free grain mix that we use that's semi-similar to chicken feed. But we know that in order for that benefit of food conversion and feed conversion to be efficient, integrating a good portion of food waste to our insects' diet will not only kind of boost their phytonutrient levels, but we can also remove some of that waste from the landfills and from that stream. But when we look at other aspects like, for instance, the black soldier fly, which is a widely touted insect that can be used for things like aquaculture feed or pig feed, they are much more equipped to take on a tremendous amount of food waste consumption. So the black soldier fly, for instance, can break down pretty much any type of food waste and any biodegradable waste that's not paper-based. And then when we look at things like mealworms have microbes in their gut that actually allow them to break down a certain percentage of polystyrene. And so that there's some research from Michigan State with Stanford that they're doing now in terms of looking at how to perhaps extract and duplicate these microbes and look at a way that we can actually start reducing styrofoam waste as well, as kind of a duality there. So right now we are preparing to raise our seed round and build out our pilot facility in Detroit. We are looking at a couple of properties in Southwest Detroit where we would grow and process our insects in one space, and our largest customer segment will probably be other food manufacturers making things that they can incorporate this ingredient into. So that's kind of the long short of what we're doing with Detroit Ento. Like I said, feel free to try some crickets, and I'll be here if you guys have questions at the end as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Let's move on to, I'm going to go to Meg, please, and leave Renee for last, if you don't mind. Okay.
Well, it's hard to follow such a science-filled introduction. That was amazing. So my name is Meg. I currently work for a startup vertical hydroponic farm on the Lower East Side of Detroit. For those of you that are familiar, most Detroiters want to know the exact intersection. It's at Mount Elliott and Lafayette. You're welcome to come visit and look at our plants. We are all vertical, which means 5 rows high on steel racking that you might be familiar with, storing pallets of processed food. We're growing plants there, and it's all indoors, so we're growing 365, some of the same benefits my co-panelists just mentioned, under LED fiber optic lights. We're right now growing herbs, microgreens, and greens in response to what the market in Detroit has been looking for. The farm has been open for about 6 months, and it's been a grand adventure. We have found some great reception from Detroiters that are interested in buying our products. And I myself was a skeptic. I worked on the other side of the desk as a buyer for most of my career and really felt like hydroponics were some sort of fancy science experiment, and there would never be a business case there, and also there would never be the flavor there. And that was really the perspective I came from, having started my food industry career in the kitchen, was can we get the flavor out of fruits and vegetables that are grown indoors under lights that don't have the terroir of the soil? And like, count me as a believer now. The food that we're growing can feed families 365 days a year in Detroit through the winter with wonderful flavor and nutritional benefits. And that has been quite a wonderful journey to go through personally as well as professionally, and trying to navigate the waters of Detroit in an additive, not extractive way. So the food waste aspect of the work that we do at Planted is really kind of interesting from my perspective as a food business nerd. Most agriculture is grown on spec, right? If you are a farmer that's growing broccoli, you make a decision in September that you want to sell broccoli next April, and you just hope that Americans are still eating broccoli in 6 months. And then you proceed to invest your time, money, and effort into growing those beautiful broccoli plants, and it's 100% speculative for the most part, unless you're at a very large scale and you're contract growing, which there's still risk inherent in that. From the opposite perspective, the kind of growing that we're doing at Planting is 100% tailored to what the chefs want to buy from us. So they say, how about Mizuna? We say, we'll buy the seed tomorrow, and then 27 days from that day, we can have Mizuna available to deliver to their restaurants and onto the plates for Detroit consumers to eat, which is pretty fabulous. And while it doesn't translate exactly to all of the row crop agriculture that we really depend on for most of our diet here in America, it is a really great amendment to make a slightly more sustainable food system. Before I joined the team at Planted, I spent the last 18 months trying to get small format grocery launched in Detroit. It is still a path, and I hope to get there soon. So watch this space. But before that, I worked for Blue Apron. So most of you in the room are probably familiar. I'm seeing some heads nodding. So National Meal Kit Delivery Service. I was there for just under 2 years. Years 4 to 6 in the trajectory of that gigantic meteoric rise startup. And I was on the supply chain team on the West Coast, leading the team that was sourcing and buying all of the food that went into the boxes, and then moved on to a national team where we were doing sort of the predictive analysis of what we needed to buy in order to fulfill the needs of the recipes that were going into that box, which actually looked a lot like talking to my wonderful chefs that had worked for Michelin-starred restaurants in Manhattan that were now writing recipes for meal kits, and then talking to my wonderful smallholder farmers about how they could match up what they could grow to what these chefs could dream up, and then making that fit the Americans' desire of making broccoli and chicken breast on a Tuesday night. So needless to say, it was a challenge in terms of process, in terms of equity, in terms of really bringing both my ethics as well as my education and experience to the table, and extremely educational for me personally. And Blue Apron is doing a lot of wonderful things, just like other meal kits out there, and lots more to say about that, perhaps over beers later. Before that, I worked for a family-owned grocery chain in Northern California, Nevada, 120 units, and that was very educational and wonderful, and that's part of what makes me want to open a grocery store today, was working for a grocery store that, while it was a conventional grocer, much like Safeway or Kroger that we are familiar with here in the Midwest, it was everyone's Raley's. It was my Raley's. It was the one on my corner. It was where I shopped every day. And feeding Americans in that way and understanding the complex relationship that exists between the manufacturers of processed food and also those giant farmers that are growing those florets of broccoli that we eat every week, to the grocery stores who are placing those products on shelf, to the consumer who's buying them every day, is a really interesting story that honestly most American consumers are not aware of. And I really enjoyed that opportunity as a category manager to make the decisions that I felt both benefited the food system as a whole and offered the consumer some interesting choice and was sustainable both financially as well as environmentally for all the stakeholders along that chain. So while I was at Raley's, I was a First Mover Fellow, which our panel moderator mentioned. And what that is basically is Aspen Institute's program for growing leaders to help them to launch a program that's not exactly within their column of work, but adjacent, that they're passionate about. So I took that opportunity to launch America's first imperfect produce program, which was really fun and super challenging as well, in that I was challenging this conventional grocer and conventional industry standards of what good produce means. And interestingly, I actually just clicked on an article yesterday about how we watch this rise of imperfect produce right now. We see misfits even in our Meijers and in Kroger's across the country, and consumer interest is waning. And so I think that's a really interesting aspect of this conversation, right, is that like we collectively, I think, have all done this work to try and teach Americans about all of the food that we're wasting. And we got part of the way there, and then somehow some thread of that story dropped, or what you were saying at dinner is really relevant to this, right, is really convincing people to change their behaviors, and we're seeing those misfits now being pulled off shelf. Mm-hmm. So, and again, that all comes down to the category manager and the grocer making those decisions, and that's why I think the neighborhood grocer is so very important in healing our American food system, because those decisions that you're making at the desk every day affect what American families are feeding their babies every night at home. It's such an important role to play. So that's not my full 10 minutes, but I think that really covers the story, and I can't wait for us all to have a conversation later.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, let's do a clicker. Let's see. All right. There it is. Wait a minute, what happened? Okay. Technology, we'll blame that.
What the right answer is. No. Really? Interesting. But like so valuable in agriculture.
I don't know. Well, I know what the answer is. Ladybug. Right. So ladybugs have a foul odor, and it deters predators. So for most growers who are dealing with pests that are destroying their crop, oftentimes we will release ladybugs into our garden sites to eat the aphids and the other pets that we do not want. Ladybugs also have a toxic effect on other animals when eaten. So we don't want to eat those. But interesting. Okay, let's try another one. Okay, which of these is true about food waste? Thinking. Thinking. Aha. All right. Right, everything but D.
That would be
Okay.
great though.
Yeah, they're good. Okay, Renee, how about you, my dear? You're up.
So I get the fun part. Both Anthony and Meg talked about eating stuff, right? I'm not going to talk about eating stuff. My name's Renee Wallace, and I have the pleasure and privilege of serving as the executive director and project portfolio manager for Food Plus Detroit. And our focus and our work is really how do we do innovation in food systems projects, and taking a look at key kind of opportunities. When we formed Food Plus Detroit, the seed of that idea was back in 2012. And we were thinking about adding another organization to the body of work in Detroit. You always have to ask yourself, why? Why would you do that, right? And when we were thinking about the organization, we thought about ways in which we could do this work different, taking, a systems approach, taking an approach where we look at how do we do our work, collaboratively around systems building. So our work really focuses on projects like with livestock. So we talk about it as a concept and idea is great, we want to have this, but you have to build a whole system to be able to sustain that. So we do our work around creating enabling environments, so starting with policy. Do you have the policy that's even going to allow for that? And we approach that in a very participatory way, understanding all of the players in a conversation like that, and what is it going to mean to each of them to successfully move forward in meeting a particular need. So what matters to the people in the community, their voices, and holding participatory methods of engagement to really listen carefully and closely to people. I call it the whatabouts. When people show up, they want to know about the whatabouts. And so being able to engage people in these conversations and look at how do we put something in place from beginning to end. So we're having this conversation about food, and I talk about the fact everybody eats, right? Is that true? Does everybody eat? Right? I think that's a true statement, right? And but everybody eats. We ate, now what? Right? So what really happens to the food that we don't eat? So when we were thinking about our work, we were looking at what was present in the system at that time. And what was missing in the system was what happened to the food that we didn't eat. Outside of rescue, there really wasn't much going on in the way of diverting the food that we didn't eat, that could not be eaten by people, that could not be fed to the animals per se, because we don't have a lot of animals. We don't have animals legally in the city yet. We're working on that. But what happened? So that's how we end up with this whole, what does your next look like? Is that as we looked in our food system, we were looking at opportunities to strategically strengthen the system and to put something in place that would help to close, the loop. We're still working on that. Remember, this conversation started in 2012. This is a journey to get there. As we looked at this work, it gives us, the opportunity to talk to people. When you talk to people about food, when I talk to growers, you ask the question, where does food waste start? When does it start? My contention is it starts when you buy the land, possibly, right? Depending on what you're planning to do with that land, how you're going to use it. It definitely starts when you drop the first seed. if you haven't thought about who's going to eat that food. So if you drop that seed and you really haven't thought about who's going to eat that food, it's a high probability or a probability that you have just created food waste at the start of the process. So the numbers we see here, often we always get all, discombobulated about the 40% of the food we didn't eat. We drew a picture of all those resources starting from the dropping of that first seed. The person who prepared that soil, the ones who came out and weeded, and the watering, and all those things. So that waste stream, is all along the way. Part of the work that we're involved in deals with the fact that we have a cultural situation in how we think about things, right? We can show you pictures of all the food, and our behavior might move a little bit. In our work, we tend to work in really 3 spaces. In the policy space, to create an enabling environment so we can do the right thing, right? So we can actually have the system that allows for it. Our present legislation isn't necessarily that comprehensive, but that's changing, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit. But also, we have to have an environment in community that's open to changing our culture and changing our habits and becoming stewards. So just even change the language. I don't actually talk about it as waste. I talk about resource. So our project is positioned, we talk about it as people's compost, waste to resource initiative, and shifting people's minds around, what it is that we're actually doing here. So we work with conversations in community. I had an opportunity to work with some folks summer before last, and we were having some conversations about food ethics, the new food ethics. And I was intrigued by that conversation, so I asked, well, how can we talk about food waste through an ethics lens? And we created an experience that we hosted at the African World Festival last year in Detroit. And what we did was we gave people a bag of what had to be fake food. My budget didn't allow for real food, right? So it was a simulated meal. And a profile. And the profile asked you, okay, what do you do? This was your meal, you ate, now what? What are you gonna do with the food that you didn't eat, right? And we asked people beforehand what happened, and then we took them through an experience. So let's say that Meg said to me that, well, I'm done, black can. So we would send Meg over to the station that we had in our place where the incinerator was. Because most people don't know that away in Detroit, when you drop food in the black can, it goes to the incinerator. And most people don't know that. So when you send them over there to experience the fact that, oh, you just dropped that in the incinerator, and what does the incinerator do? And then we breathe it, right? People are horrified when they find that out. And they're incentivized to think about, oh, I think I want to do something else. What else can I do? So we had them experience different stations. Over here, you could give that meal to your friend Anthony. Anthony is happy about that because Anthony likes to eat, right? He loves to eat. Yes, see, I told you. So you find friends who like to eat, right? We also introduced them to people who could repurpose food. They know how to, it was this 1 minute and they do magic with food, so they create another meal out of it, right? But then there was still inevitably food that did not get eaten. And people didn't know much about, the first year we did it, people really didn't know much about composting. So we got different answers in year 1 than year 2. When people came back, more folks are getting exposed to dropping things, in, sharing it. Your kitchen bucket, to your lovely little Home Depot bucket with the screw top, not that one that takes all kind of gorilla strength to take the top off, right? Not that one. I found a little screw top, you know. So for $10, you can get a whole nice little set, right? You know, so you too can do this. I prove that to people. You can do this, you know. And so we had people go through this experience so you could see the whole path that your food would take. And at the end of it, we had you go to the end of the station, and now it's time for you to sort this meal. Now, you didn't get to pick this meal. You didn't get to determine how it was cooked. Remember, it's fabricated, it's in a bag. So we've got a green bin, a black bin, a green bin, a blue bin, and a black bin. And so now you're sorting this meal, and you could imagine how people's behavior, what it was like when they're sorting a meal. If they could drop most of it in the green bin, they're really happy. But the people who had gone through this lovely experience with us, dropping it in the black bin, they were like, what can we do? So part of my contention in this is, how do we create that stewardship? How do we create that resourcefulness in our thinking? How do we change the culture? Because we can change the policy all you want, right? We can change it. The environment is enabling. But if I'm the eater and I don't drop it in the right can, or if I'm the chef and I'm still throwing it in the black bin, what have we done? So our work involves both the change side of it. Our work involves engaging and having conversations with people so they know the benefits of us having an ecosystem with haulers and, you know, people who depackage and sort things and all of those things, so that we can actually do this. And we can do it as good actors, because we definitely promote knowing how to do this work. So I tell people, composting is not just throwing a bunch of stuff in a pile over here, and then you come back and you got this beautiful soil. I don't know where people get that concept from, right? Because that isn't how it works. That there's a way in which to do this. So we spend time, you know, in the education side as well, because what that does is help to fend off the whatabouts. Your neighbors want to know, what about that smell? Because you thought you could just throw it in this pile and it was going to become this beautiful black gold. Not so, right? They were concerned about, what does it look like? So in the city, I'm giving you the whole context, because in order for us to do something about this, we have to do it in a way that's accepted by the people in the places where we live. So being able to put this in the neighborhood, I'm working with Jerry and Billy at their farm. What does that look like when you nestle this whole process in the middle of a neighborhood? What does that look like? How do we do that in a way that's acceptable? I've got your attention. You think it's the right thing to do. Now, how do we do this in an urban environment in a way that fits into the environment? So that's part of our work. You know, the policy side, being out talking to people so we understand why we as citizens, why should Renee care? Understanding it, being able to help me, you know, so these lovely exquisite invitations into this conversation that we make, so people can figure out why it's going to motivate them to participate, you know, in this work. Working with farmers to scale up their operations, hanging out with folks in the city to deal with ordinances, to deal with land disposition, because if you have no land, can you actually do this? You know, so all of those things are a part of the work that we do in helping to cultivate this shift so that we can reduce this amount of food waste and produce not only soil that works for agricultural purposes, but we're helping people understand that it's also cleaning our air, you know, that it's also helping us to deal with stormwater management, because we don't like flooded basements. So I tell people, I stop talking about composting and start talking about compost and soil-based solutions, so that folks see the reason why we want to be on board, you know, with this work. And it's a lot of fun. You know, it's really interesting talking to people and watching their perspectives change. Well, what do I do? You know, now you have opportunity to really cultivate, you know, a change in the community. And we're at the front end of that, which most of you probably know. It's kind of infancy stage, but that's the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you so much. I want to jump to what's happening in the United States. Within the United States, there's an initiative led by USDA and the Environmental Protection Agency where there is a goal to reduce waste, food waste, by 50% by year 2030. So this is 2019, right? And there's not a lot of conversation locally about that. Even I think the state of Michigan has a plan similar to that. So my question is, do you, panelists, feel we're on track to reach that goal? And if yes, tell me what you see happening. And if you do not think we're on track, what do we need to do? Anybody?
What I'll say is that we are moving in the direction increasingly. So that goal is aggressive. I learned about that goal, 5-7 years ago, and it was aggressive then. So it's really aggressive now as we get closer to it, but we're moving more in that direction. And why do I say that? I say that because of some of the things that are happening at the state level here. Our state is moving us in the direction away from disposable mindset as it relates to dropping in the black can. It goes to away, right, to sustainable materials management. And there's legislation that's moving forward to facilitate the environment to make that happen, right? So one of the things that happened last year was a bill that was passed that funded this work. So the DEQ, whose name is now Eagle, will have money to help market development, to do education, to do compliance and enforcement and those kinds of things. And then there's also money coming to help actually do infrastructure development and innovation so that we can actually build the systems to do this work. So when you look at things like that, it's putting us, we're heading in the right direction. Now, it's still a steep climb because it takes time to build these systems. You know, as I've been listening to people talk about this work and studying about it over the time we've been in it, it takes, 10 years, in some cases 20 years to really fully build full-blown systems. So here we're at 2019, and so 20 years from now we'll be on the other side of 2030, right? But that's okay because we're moving. I mean, this was Herculean to get this legislation out, and the new legislation that's going to do the practice, we still have to get that through, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but we're on track. We're on track.
I think to your earlier point, Renee, about behavior change and how it's a long, slow process, I feel like all of the conversation in the media that has been out there around this goal and other sort of corporate entities' goals for reduction of food waste have raised consciousness around waste altogether. So for example, for Planted, we sell at Eastern Market, and we sell in a plant-based plastic clamshell because that's like our disposable solution that's better than a polystyrene grocery bag. And we have a number of regular customers that bring their own reusable bag. So they aren't talking to us about food waste even though we're selling them food, but they're thinking about the materials and wasting the product that conveys the food to their home. And I think we definitely see that trend in Detroit of a lot more compostable materials being used for takeout containers and utensils, and we see restaurants using a lot more reusable products. So I think that there is some sort of a change in mindset and thinking about how we eat and how that generates waste on all these levels. But I definitely don't see like portion sizes changing or people thinking about how they order in a restaurant. I always think from a retail perspective, you don't see people reducing the amount of groceries they buy because they see how much they throw out at the end of the week. And I would be surprised if there was a huge shift in people composting at home. But I would love to know actually in the audience, like, can you raise your hand if you compost at home? Wow. That's amazing. That's a pretty high percentage.
Yeah, it is. That's good.
We compost at home, but there's no municipal composting in
yet.
Detroit. So there's a couple of sort of small business people that pick up those bins that you were talking about that do stink a little on the back porch. Yeah. What do you think, Anthony?
Oh, I'll turn mine off. I'll turn mine off.
No, from my perch, we look at it in a similar way, but food waste, as like you're saying, a resource, it has a lot of different dimensions to accessibility. A lot of these farms that are taking on more food waste, like I mentioned before, are more geared towards animal feed and livestock feed. And the model that seems to be working, like a company called Grub Tubs in Austin, Texas, Austin has a pretty revolutionary food waste law now where restaurants cannot waste. They have to compost or privately, pay for some sort of composting service. And so this company, which also grows those fly larvae, the black soldier fly, will go to restaurants. The restaurants will pay them to pick up their waste. They pick up the waste, bring it to the fly farm, return the tubs. And it's actually equally as lucrative to pick up and process that waste as it is to sell the actual fly meal and the oil and the fertilizer byproduct. And so we like to, like I said, crickets are omnivorous, but they're not as, voracious as like worms would be. But we try to have the similar mindset in terms of how we construct the systems that we're going after. So a good example of that is chitin. So chitin it's a biopolymer. It's the hard part of the exoskeleton that you find in crab, shrimp, and mollusk shells. Well, crickets are also very high in chitin. When we think about these types of new systems and industry, the Industrial Revolution 4.0 is all about regenerative materials, right? And the kind of idea we have here is how can we create these multiple byproducts and streams out of a single source? And so for us, chitin, that exoskeleton, can be removed from the cricket itself, and we can then use that to create things like bioplastics or edible films that you can put on vegetable coatings, or could even be used as like a Metamucil type replacement. And so in the exact same way, we in the future envision some sort of biodigester or anaerobic digestion component to what we're doing so that we can utilize more of that food resource, food waste, and actually turn it into an input to our system. So we can, once we think beyond just food as a waste, we have to think energy systems, right? How do we become, net energy in terms of what we're consuming? And I'm starting to see some movement there on the biodigester side, but it's extremely expensive technology to use, and it's very difficult logistically. So that factory, the plant, I think, which all of us, or at least I know you two have visited, they were building an anaerobic digester to create natural gas and electricity to power their plant, and they had a $4 million digester that was supposed to take on about 60,000 tons of waste a week that they couldn't even, legislatively allow, the city wouldn't even allow them to procure that much waste in a single location. We find the same type of issue. Because eating insects is not federally regulated, the USDA doesn't have guidelines. The FDA says if its intended use is for human consumption, that's what you can do. We have a lot of hurdles in our regulatory process to even feed the food waste to the crickets, because they're like, well, this could be mold, this can create food safety issues, and it's like, so I can see on both sides. There are people pushing that forward, but there's little things. It's not little. It's legislative.
Right. Exactly.
It's not people's desire to want, as we can see, to compost.
Exactly, and I'll piggyback on that. So while I said a moment ago that legislatively we're moving in the right direction, we are also a risk-averse society, right? So while we say we want to increase the recycling rates and we want to get more of this moved so we can meet these wonderful goals, because they are wonderful goals, we've got this kind of tension in, okay, if we take in more food waste, the process to properly manage that is more intense, right? So the probability of bad acting also went up, right? So when you talk to legislators who like being elected, and they like constituents to like them, they don't want complaint calls, right? You have to figure out, how do we move those numbers? So when you look at the legislation, those of us at the table saying, we know how to be good actors, this is how you be good actors, and this is what we need to produce a product, but you've got to deal with the folks who are regulating, so you get a 10% amount of food waste. Now we're generating how much percent? If it's waste, it's 100%, right? But we can only take in, on average, 10% of that even in the new legislation. And if you decide to take on more than 10, the cost and the regulation and process for you is more intense. So you can see that it's going to be some tension trying to get to that high number, right? So while we're really good at setting these fabulous goals, they're shiny, they're really nice, and everybody wants to talk about them. But to step into that, we've got to get past some of the risks, and be willing to take on some, whether it's on the enforcement side or on the education side, to build the capacity for people to actually do this work, right, both in the regulation and in the development of the businesses and the technology and the favorability inside our communities to get there. So we're part of that solution in terms of our own thinking about it, and helping our legislators see that we could lower that risk because we're willing to take it on as citizens.
Thank you. I'm going to shift a little bit and direct this question to Meg. Congratulations, by the way, on being one of the 4 finalists winning the 2018 Comerica Hatch Award.
Thank you.
Yay!
It was fun.
So I know you mentioned that you're still on track to open in 2019. Yeah.
Yes. I'm just going to go ahead and say yes to that.
One of the points you acknowledge focusing on is repurposing food, which I'm really excited about. One of the chefs that we work with, Chef Phil, had an amazing festival last year from waste to food, and he held it at the Eastern Market, and it was amazing. And so just to even think of a grocery store where, we're actually repurposing food to sustain a shelf life is amazing. So can you talk more about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the reasons I'm so excited about opening the concept that I've developed for small format grocery is not just about feeding families in the neighborhoods where they live, though that really is the foundation of it, but it's around innovating the grocery model. And when I say innovating, I mean changing the way we do it today, but not coming up with a brand new idea. Because really, grocers back in the day, before a lot of regulation, before a lot of vertical integration, grocers were using those carrots whose greens had wilted on the shelf. They were repurposing those carrots to provide a feedstock for another product that they offered. And that's exactly the concept that I hope to bring to the table at my grocery store. And just to carry the carrots example through, bunched carrots, of course, people love. Not everybody uses the greens for carrot greens pesto, though you all should try a recipe for that if you haven't. But a lot of people do like just regular carrots, so you can just cut off the tops and those will. When those carrots start to look a little bit ashen, then maybe you can peel those and make them into carrot sticks, which a lot of moms love to grab and go snack for their kids, and then you're not throwing out those carrots. So then if at a certain point maybe those carrots get a little bit tired, it's still perfectly good, right? We've used carrots for these many days, 2 days, 3 days from that were sitting in your refrigerator. Then it can become carrot soup, or it can become carrot stew, or it can become a carrot that's in a chicken pot pie. And that way you're reducing, shrink is the word that we use in grocery, but it's food waste at each point along the journey. And the thing that I get the most jazzed about with regard to that is teaching people about it, right? In a small format store, you don't have a lot of employees. Everybody's involved in everything, and everyone knows the customer when they come in. So they're going to see you breaking down those carrots or making that soup, and then you can pass along that knowledge and that joy of reusing the food. And also, it makes business sense too, which is what's so frustrating from a traditional grocer's perspective. And we definitely face this challenge at Raley's. Was like, yeah, we would really love to be able to reuse those carrots, but our labor cost is sky high because we have a 20,000 or 40,000 square foot store, which requires 100 people to run it. And so we can't do anything but make sure that those folks are stocking shelves. We can't redirect them to make carrot soup because then we wouldn't make any margin on that carrot soup. So I think by reducing your overhead, reducing your infrastructure cost, and making sure that you're paying attention, like we were discussing earlier, to efficiency at every stage in the game, then I think there's a lot of opportunity to not only reduce that food waste, but really make good business sense. So.
Right. Thank you so much for also touching on the education piece, because that was like the second part of my question. Like, are you along the way, are you also sharing that education to the consumer or with the consumer so that it goes beyond the store?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then when I launched that Imperfect Produce program at Raley's, that was one of the first things we did. Was we had these tiny pears, which were waste from the pear growers. First of all, that was the biggest challenge with trying to find imperfect produce. The growers didn't know that they had waste. They were like, oh, I just turned that bad looking broccoli over into the soil. It's not waste. And I was
Right.
like, but entropy. And so just give me some of those small pears. It'll be fine. But we didn't want people to see these small, slightly scarred pears on shelf and be like, what do I do with that? It's 2 bites if I eat it out of hand. So we paired a recipe with every imperfect produce that we put on shelf. And I really do think that made a big difference. Maybe people didn't make those recipes, but it got them over the hump of thinking about how to utilize something that isn't that perfect, shiny, shouldery apple,
Cool. Thank you. Anthony, I had a question for you as well. And maybe you answered it, but I'm just still stuck on why crickets, number one. And then how does that connect to food waste directly?
Yeah.
Make that connection for me.
Yeah, we'll do the food waste side first. So when we think about a benefit of insects, the big 3, like I mentioned before, are the health benefits, the environmental benefits, and then the third one is usually touching on things like feed conversion. So when we think about feeding a cow and all of the externalities that go into feeding that cow, that's where you get that 2,000 to 4,000 gallons of water per pound of beef statistic. It's not that the cow is drinking 2,000 gallons. It's the grain, it's the transportation, it's the freezing, it's all of those things combined. The processing. When you get that beef in the grocery store, that is the accumulation of that 2,000 to 4,000 gallons of water. So for us on the production end, that's a direct savings. We like to look at that as well in terms of feed conversion. So crickets take about 1.7 kilos of feed in per kilo of growth out, and the kilo is like 2.2 pounds. So just slightly more efficient than where chickens are. And beef is much higher. It's 10 to 12 kilos in per kilo of growth out. So in that, 1.7 kilos in, if we can supplant, a good 10 to 30% of that as excess scrap or some sort of byproduct from the rest of the food industry, eventually that cumulative effect can be quite high. It's, like I said, difficult to regulate the food waste aspect there, but for the larger farms in North America, for instance, Entimo Farms is a large grower in Ontario. They have about a 60,000 square foot facility, and they're producing about 15 to 25,000 pounds of cricket protein a month. So you're losing about 70 to 80% of mass when you dehydrate them into that powder. But what they consume, it's about 1,300 or so crickets per pound. So very quickly, we're talking about hundreds of millions of little mouths that in some sort of, coordinated cycle, if you can coordinate with, so for instance, they work with Loblaws, which is like their Kroger, Canada's Kroger, and now they have their own private label products there for people to buy, just like you would at Costco or Trader Joe's. And if they were able to take a portion of that food waste from the grocery store, process it somehow and feed it to their crickets, you can start to see quite a large impact in terms of what you can do with this excess food waste and upcycling it really into the nutrition of the insect. So even though ours is at a much, much smaller scale, we're looking at about a 10,000 square foot facility to begin. We estimate that not only can we add nutrition to the crickets, but we can also drop our feed cost quite a bit. If we're able to do at least 30%, food waste input to our grain-based feed, it's a savings of a couple $1,000s a month, and that will continue to expound as the facility grows. And to answer, and then that's much, much larger, like I said, for the fly larvae. We're talking about millions of metric tons that some of the larger fly farms are able to take on in terms of food waste. So they're a better vehicle for that. And then I guess the short answer on why crickets, when we're thinking about the future of food and where this food's going to come from, I think an article came out in Forbes a few days ago on capitalism will starve us by 2050. I don't know if anyone saw that. It's quite true. With the way our population's growing and at the rate of which we're consuming protein, we don't have enough viable land mass to grow the amount of animals that we do for the type of diets we have today. And so it's not just a luxury, it's going to be a necessity that we start looking at other alternatives like yesterday. Now, whether that is byproduct and meal from alternative grains that require less water or hydroponic-based feed, insects are still they're the largest biomass on the planet, moving biomass outside of plants, of course. And in that realm, we're talking about kind of an unlimited potential for feed. And even if we don't eat it, if we feed the animals that we eat insects, there's still a tremendous savings in water. So even pea protein, which is super healthy, is about 300 gallons of water per pound, and crickets are only 5 gallons of water per pound. And so when we think about those types of savings, we have to start kind of, like you're saying, it has to be a complete consumer shift. We produce powder because that's an easy form you throw into a smoothie or a baked good, and you don't have to necessarily look at it. But there's 2 billion people that eat insects every day already, and it's not just a luxury, it's a necessity food. Right. And so we have to think about this out of the sense of how are we able to sustain ourselves in a way that may require less calories to produce that food, and definitely will require a fraction of the resources that we use today to produce the food. So it's not necessarily everyone's taste, but it's about changing the mindset to where by the time we're our parents' age, we're not so afraid of it.
Right.
Hopefully
I'll get there
way
one
before
day.
then.
Well, I think we have about 20 minutes. I have one more question, but I'm not going to be selfish. I'll open the questions up to you all out there. Anybody? Thank you. Questions? No? Here's one.
Hi, I'm Susan. I am a local resident who's very interested in food sustainability, and we do compost, and we do turn our old carrots into soup. My question is about the crickets, and you mentioned chitin. How do you get the chitin off the crickets? Is that a manual process? Oh, he's going to show me.
Yeah, so and how naturally if you eat some of those crickets, you're going to get the chitin, naturally ingesting it. The chitin industry now is quite heavy on chemical processing. It's usually a two-step process. You usually have to acidify to separate it from the crab or shrimp shell, and then you have to refine it and acetylize it to make it actually usable. So usually you get the first stage chitin, and then the second stage is chitinase. So it's actually almost identical to cellulose, which is the most abundant biomaterial in the world. Chitin is like the insect version of that. So for us, the benefit of doing chitin extraction, which I'm telling this is 3+ years out, but we're starting the research now. It requires a lot less chemicals. We can pretty much do it in a fermentation process. We found some researchers at Michigan State that are taking fungal chitin, chitin from mushrooms, and they're pulling it out and it has antimicrobial properties naturally, and they're using it as a preservative in pig feed. And so we're thinking that we can do a very similar process from crickets. Now, the other side of this is that it's another waste product. So talking about crab and shrimp, they're getting the shells and tails as a byproduct of the shrimping industry. So it's less than a penny per pound, which obviously we can't compete with yet. But the same idea as climate change affects and acidification of the ocean affects those stocks and overfishing affects those stocks, we can start looking at other sources. Algae is going to be another one that has a decent potential for pulling that out. So naturally, if you eat shellfish, because crickets are actually in the same genus as shrimp, or the same family, they're both arthropods, you can get that chitin as well. But most people will buy it. If you go to your co-op or food store, they have chitin capsules right next to things like chlorella or other nutrients. So if you're not privy to eating those, you can still get those benefits at the supermarket.
And I'm sitting with this big grin because crickets and shrimp, okay.
They're land shrimp.
They are.
I was like, okay, I might have to mull that one over for a minute.
They just the same genus.
I was interested in the chitin being used for bioplastics. as well.
And then I'll shut up because I can go on forever on this. So the chitin itself, it's a biopolymer, and so they can use it in a number of different ways. I met a researcher in South Korea who is using chitin from crab and shrimp shells and is 3D printing it into rigid plastics. So from the exact same concept as self-healing concrete, like it cracks, the oxygen exposes it, it starts foaming and makes, the exact same idea can be done with crickets, or with chitin, excuse me. So our minds are going to that next step. How do we create zero waste? How do we create an actual system made of plastic, made of insects, made of chitin, right? And so when we start thinking in that 4th degree, where we can start creating another dimension of usability and upcycling, that's what we're kind of looking at. Another researcher we met is taking chitin, and she makes a thin plastic-like edible film where you can dip strawberries or dip that broccoli or that carrot. Now you have an edible coating that is an oxygen-proof barrier and it's food safe, and you can extend the shelf life of that food that much further. A third quick example would be like that packaging there. Let's say I have a package of insects and the packaging is made of insects. That's that 4th degree that we're trying to solve for.
One right here.
Hi, I'm Alice. I don't know if I should introduce myself. Okay. I have a question for Anthony about the crickets as well. So I'm sort of interested in crickets and doing my own research and implementing crickets just in the everyday household. But something that I've come across is that a lot of people are just grossed out by crickets. So how do you sort of overcome that, and how are you trying to convince people that this is a possible answer or solution?
Yeah, it was definitely an underestimation on our end, the amount of consumer education we would have to do. But we thought it was there's this growing market. It's got 42% CAGR over the next 5 years. This is going to be easy. No, absolutely, you're absolutely right. The consumer education is by far the biggest part. And for us, it's all about, even though we don't manufacture the end food product, it's about making delicious food. So we too have worked with local chefs like Chef Phil. We do a lot of pop-up dinners to educate people. We have to create recipes all the time, demos at gyms and different places to get people engaged in a way that doesn't kind of take them out of their ordinary routine. we find that like 9 times out of 10, someone will buy a protein bar with crickets in it versus buying the powder that they can make their own cornbread out of, right? Because it's just that extra step. But education's the key to that for us. And so we've done a lot of work with DPS, Detroit Public Schools, where we've done a STEM program last summer. We worked with 2 culinary high schools. We kind of took them through the whole process. We set up a cricket farm in the school. We taught them how to use the protein, and then ended up making samples for about 1,000 6th through 10th graders in the form of baked goods, and so they were sweet and it's a little bit easier to digest there. But nonetheless, it's the same principle of farming as well. Like if a child grows and they learn how to take care of the soil and they learn how to plant that seed and they make food out of something that they grew, like they're not going to be afraid of it anymore. And we try to take that same concept, a little bit expedited with people. So anytime we do a demo, we bring a recipe, whether it's falafel or a smoothie or peppermint bark or soup or a veggie burger. We have to make it applicable for people and easy for them to use to say, oh yeah, this isn't something I'm afraid of. And quite frankly, like they taste like sunflower seeds or burnt popcorn. And if you mix it into something, you wouldn't taste it. If I give you 2 cookies, so besides the shellfish allergy, the placebo effect works pretty well. I can give you a cookie and say it's in there and you'll be grossed out, but I can give you that same one and say it's not in there when it actually is, and you would eat it and not notice. So it's literally just, it's mostly perspective, because the nutrition's there, the benefits are there.
I know we could ask Anthony many more questions, and so I want you to come up afterwards and ask him. Maybe we can get another one in, but are there any questions right now for Renee or Meg? I have some if none of you do, but I want to see if anybody in the audience has questions.
Hi, Meg. My name's Charlotte. Thanks for hanging with us tonight. Question for you just about your career. It seems like you've had the opportunity to work in many different parts of the food system, and I was curious as to how you've kind of curated your career and how you decide when to make the next step, or is it just not as planned out, or just curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I thank you for phrasing that so kindly. My favorite is on a job interview when people are like, your resume is interesting. I mean, mostly I get bored fast and I need a challenge every day. When I graduated from college with a degree in biology, I was like, well, I'm definitely going to veterinary school. And then I met my wife and she was like, if I won the lottery tomorrow, I would still go to veterinary school. And I was like, I don't feel that way, so I should find a different career. And I got a job working front of house at a bakery and just fell in love with the idea of buying from local growers and feeding to my neighbors and the whole food systems idea. And that led me down the path. And when I felt like I had gotten to a place where I had learned as much as I could at that place of work, I looked for a different point in the food chain where I could learn some more. So it's an evolution. I highly recommend taking a lot of hard labor jobs where you don't get paid enough when you're in your early 20s, because it really forces you to think about the work that you truly want to do, and then you value the people that work for you once you get into leadership. So I think that's the one-liner I'll give you. And you're welcome to message me if you want have more conversation.
Hi, my name's Sonia. I have a question that I think applies to maybe all of you, or you can speak about it if you want. But I'm curious if there are gaps in the food waste, food safety application or just other factors such as people's behaviors or conceptions that we have that are limiting the legislation and application of using food waste.
Yeah, just thinking about that. So you're saying beyond the behavior. For people that are, so I talked about education a lot from the community's standpoint, understanding the benefits of it. But even people who are on the production side, as we've been talking to Anthony, there's science behind everything, right? A lot of the folks who part of the gap in getting there is people not having that knowledge. taking the time to learn how to compost. When I first started looking at this, my familiarity was with people doing backyard. And then I went to a compost operators training, and I walked out of there understanding it is a manufacturing process, right?
Totally.
But there is science. There's science to that. There's process and practice to that. And a lot of times people are resistant to that level of structure. It's a big shift to go from thinking we're just, putting stuff over here to it is a very defined process. Defined in how you educate people to even collect the resource that you want, to get the hauler, to make sure that they didn't not sending you already stuff you can't use. The process, most people are not really heavy in the process. We live in a world of process. They're invisible to us most of the time. And so getting people to come through that learning curve is part of it as well. Because you have to learn each part of this system. And so we're seeing a little bit of it's a creep. So what you see really big operations. So they can handle the volumes of materials that we produce in hospitals and schools and stuff like that. And then you got this big gap because I can do my backyard, right? In the middle, a lot of stuff is still ending up, if you don't have curbside yet, and it takes a while to get to curbside, and let's pray that we do opt out as opposed to opt in, because opt in gets you a low rate of growth as opposed to you have to opt out. People typically go along when it's already in there, so that growth in people learning how to do this system's work, is what I'm also seeing is part of the challenge. So education is part of that, but the willingness to work in a highly structured way is a leap for some folks.
And I would add, from a business perspective, having worked in bigger businesses trying to implement things like, waste stream mitigation, diverting organics, even if the business case is there, even if there's a municipal partner that's willing to help, there is just a reticence to change, which connects back to what Renee is talking about human behavior change. But also there is a certain archetype of people that are running the world's corporations, and those old white guys often don't want to change. And I'm joking, but it's really real. And it really requires a lot of people like you all taking jobs at big companies and trying to shake shit up, because unless we get into the boardroom and express the importance and tell a story that makes you think about how your everyday behaviors impact the world, then nothing's going to change, right? So I know I'm preaching to the choir, but it's so important that everyone remember that we all have an opportunity to affect change, and it's not just in choosing to bring your lunch in a tiffin. It's about making your work have to do with making our food system more sustainable, or whatever it is that you're passionate about, and get into that boardroom and change their minds.
We could probably go a couple more minutes, but I think that's a really good way to end tonight. So let's thank all of our panelists again. Mom and Jerry.